Coming up on this episode,
a mature Christian adult can struggle over issues without putting their whole faith at risk. If you're not in touch with the divine, getting revelation, you're left to your own devices and to philosophers. Scriptures are full of people in faith crisis. There's no shame in struggling. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 7. You're in a faith crisis? It's about time. We are going to explore what a faith crisis is and what it is not. And our goal is to show you how you can use your crisis to become spiritually buff. Today's episode is brought to you by patreon.com/openthematrixpodcast. That's right, yours truly is producing the official music for the podcast over there. We just put out 2 songs, and we'd love for you to go there. So go to patreon.com/openthematrixpodcast if you want to hear our music that I produce and sing and write. So please do that. That would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's open this matrix. Part 1, the bomb goes off. So what got to you? What did you discover? What's disgruntling you about your church, your faith, your religion? What's dysregulating your feelings, challenging your faith, and putting you in a tailspin? I think most anyone who has had faith in God or a religious affiliation has experienced this, especially in the age of the internet, because the internet and social media is full of atheists and intellectuals. And there is always a counter argument to your arguments in support of your faith. But what is the truth? Well, we're going to explore that today. So, thinking about crisis, if you think about crisis, the etymology of the word is a crucial or decisive point or situation, a turning point, or a sudden change in the course of a disease, usually at which the patient is expected to recover or to die. Now, you may not physically die if you leave behind your religion and your faith in God, but you may very well die spiritually if you leave God behind. And so I may have started this as a lighthearted tone, but I know that many of you out there are struggling with questions about God and religion, and I have been through that. And so God has kind of moved me today to reach out to you, whoever's watching this, that is experiencing these challenges. And I want you to listen to this episode all the way through, because I do feel like I get you. And I do feel like there are some steps you can take and some steps you should not take to get to the point of truth, which is really what we ought to be perceiving and pursuing in our lives if we want to ultimately be happy, is the truth. And yes, there is universal truth. Now, I think it's okay and normal to have a faith crisis. If you're an intelligent adult, like, you're going to question these things. And I think in part due to affluence. Like, we have pretty easy lives. We're not in survival mode. We're not praying God for our crops to grow generally. And so you engage in a lot of debate, or your faith is being torn down. And so this is a very normal thing in our day and age. It's always been around, but I think it's very prevalent for you to run into information that makes you sometimes question everything that you've ever been taught. Now, before I get into all the meat of this, I do want to say my feeling is definitely you should have your crisis. You should go through it, get your questions answered. But ultimately, I feel like don't waste a lot of time. I do feel like we're in the end times. I do feel like time is limited. And so I don't feel like you have years and years to go through this existential crisis and try everything, try all these substances, try out all these different churches. I feel like you ought to take this seriously and you ought to dive into it. So that's my little caveat to this discussion, is take it seriously and always keep your focus truth, universal truth. And you'll come out of this okay. In fact, you'll come out of it spiritually buff, like I said in the intro. All right, I found this great article called Why I Never Had a Faith Crisis Over Science. A lot of people lose their faith due to scientific arguments. This article is by Deb Harzma. She says, quote, "Church attendance has been dropping since well before the pandemic, with increasing numbers checking the none box when asked about their religion. The pandemic saw a significant drop in the number of U.S. adults who believe in God, particularly among young adults. Many of us are asking why and wondering what we can do. Fortunately, the Barna Research Group has been tracking data on this question. In research over a decade ago, Barna asked millennials who grew up in the church why they left. Although respondents gave several reasons, 29% said churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in, and 25% said Christianity is anti-science. 2018, Barna surveyed the next generation, Generation Z, or Gen Z. The teenagers currently attending church, and science was an even larger concern. 53% agreed that church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world. And in 2019, Barna surveyed young people all over the globe, asking them why they doubt things of a spiritual dimension, and found that science is one of the top reasons they doubt, second only to hypocrisy of religious people. And even greater than that was human suffering. Science is a growing factor in people leaving church, doubting God, and dropping away from their faith altogether. With the increased polarization over science during the pandemic, I fear this trend will only grow. End quote. There was a lot about the pandemic that didn't add up, but people seem to gain a greater trust of science, and that's trademarked, because what does the science really mean? But people gain a greater trust in some ways of the science. And so that's a lot of the reasons they're giving have to do with science, understanding the world around them, and human suffering. So why is religion suddenly declining? On Oxford University's press website, I found an article titled, "Why is Religion Suddenly Declining?" And here's what it says, quote, "From 2007 to 2020, an overwhelming majority, 43 out of 49 of these same countries, became less religious. This decline in belief is strongest in high-income countries, but it is evident across most of the world. The most dramatic shift away from religion took place among the American public. For years, the United States has been the key case demonstrating that economic modernization need not produce secularization. But recently, the American public has been moving away from religion along with virtually all other high-income countries. In fact, religiosity has been declining more rapidly in the U.S. than in most other countries. Several forces are driving this trend, but the most powerful one is the waning grip of a set of beliefs closely linked with the imperative of maintaining high birth rates. For many centuries, most societies assigned women the role of producing as many children as possible and discouraged divorce, abortion, homosexuality, contraception, and any other sexual behavior not linked with reproduction. Virtually all major world religions encouraged high fertility because it was necessary in the world of high infant mortality and low life expectancy that prevailed until recently. For the average woman to produce 5 to 8 children in order to simply replace the population. Religions that didn't emphasize these norms gradually disappeared. A growing number of countries have now attained high life expectancies and drastically reduced infant mortality rates, making these traditional cultural norms no longer necessary. This process didn't happen overnight. The major world religions have presented pro-fertility norms as absolute moral rules and firmly resisted change. People only slowly give up the familiar beliefs and societal roles they have known since childhood concerning gender and sexual behavior. But when a society reaches a sufficiently high level of economic and physical security, that's the key, younger generations grow up taking the security for granted, and the norms around fertility recede. Ideas, practices, and laws concerning gender equality, divorce, abortion, and homosexuality are now changing rapidly. Almost all high-income societies have recently reached a tipping point where the balance shifts from pro-fertility norms being dominant to individual choice norms being dominant. End quote. Okay, I know that was a long quote, but think about it. How accessible is pornography nowadays? Are you viewing pornography? If you are, it is warping the way you see the world and you see human beings. The fact that we can get cheap, never-ending pornography and our attitudes about fertility and all that change based on that, and also on survivability. We aren't in a world where we have to worry about survival. Yes, we worry about money, about paying the bills and all that. But as you see high-income countries go through several generations, now you're seeing, and you're part of this, maybe in your faith crisis is tied to this, the warping of sense of duty to reproduce the populace. Birth control has greatly altered what people think they can do because sexual behavior now seems to not have a consequence. So when people lose that focus on the norms of reproduce, procreation with God, they fill that gap in with easy sex, no consequence sex, and just no need to perpetuate the species. This fundamentally shifts your responsibilities, and life becomes a lot easier in a way. So isn't that fascinating? In that long quote is that when people no longer have to focus on survival, replacing the species, and that the norms of procreation within marriage, when that's no longer the case, all of a sudden we have a bunch of youth who don't want to have babies, don't want to get married, and they're not worried about survival. That's what comes with a high income country who throws away God. Are you doing the same in your faith crisis? Are you looking at life as, well, I just want something for me, and not worried about your children or thinking about the long-term consequences of this? Do your children want to have children? All of this comes into play as we become prosperous and rich at the hand of God, I might add. And then we turn our back on the thing that would actually perpetuate the human race, having babies and monogamy and these things that allow us to continue to prosper. So my question for you is, if you're like, how does this relate to my faith crisis? Well, do you not think you're impacted by these factors? Like, what are your politics around the family? What are your politics around the way the country should go spiritually as a society? If you're so worried about human suffering, but you're over here withdrawing from the very thing that made the country great, are you part of the problem? And is your existential crisis have something to do with you've left behind the norms that brought you into the world in the first place? Are you detaching from universal truth? Now, one thing I found interesting was on the AmericanSurveyCenter.org, they had an article called Faith After the Pandemic, How COVID-19 Changed American Religion. It shows all of these aspects of pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, and the impact on religiosity or attending church and having a faith identity has drastically shifted. It says here, quote, "Were young adults uniquely affected? No group of Americans has undergone more significant change in religious attendance than young adults. More than 4 in 10 young adults report different levels of religious participation today than they did before the pandemic." But it is really fascinating to see people's religious attendance and activity and their identity pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, especially the youth. Almost 50% of the youth either claim they don't have any religion now or that they attend far less than they did before. The one bright spot I saw is my church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The youth that were polled in this said that the 80% either stayed the same level of activity or 10% more increase. So 90% of the youth in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints either maintained or increased their religious attendance after the pandemic, which gave me a lot of hope for the members of our church. Now, as a member of that church, am I trying to get you to join my church? Yeah, I would love for you to join. But I will say we have a lot of people who leave the church, and we have a lot of people who come back. So if you're in my church and you're having a faith crisis, that's okay. I've heard all the arguments, I think, that would get someone to question our faith and to leave. And I want you to follow God, follow Christ. And so my main point is that we all churches have this challenge, especially with the youth. So my main 3 goals here are, number 1, do not abandon your belief in God, in a higher power. I want you to remember things that you already know to be true. Number 2, I want to give you a reality check about yourself, and we're going to get into that. And number 3, I want to help you to avoid destructive choices like hedonism, promiscuity, drugs, relationship destruction. Because I've seen that a lot in my life, that people who leave the church or they leave religion and God, they end up making some really terrible choices, life-altering choices. And so many of them have children, and these choices affect your children. And so that's why I said, and I warned in the beginning, think about what you're doing and make your faith crisis an exploration of faith, not a running away from it. All right, before we move on to the second part of this discussion, I want to encourage you, if you're finding value in this, to give me a tip. You can go to Venmo and look for The Firestarter. That's on Venmo. If you want to send us a little bit of a donation or whatever for this cause, I really, really appreciate it. All right, part 2. Don't be cocky. You are not unique. I want to just say it unequivocally. It sounds mean, but you're not unique or special in your faith crisis. This happens to so many people, and obviously many people experience it multiple times throughout their life. And so don't get so cocky about your problems with God or religion that you think that it puts you in a special category. No, you're searching for truth if you're honest in heart, and so are many, many other people. All right, I found this great article over on desiringgod.org called "What Does a Faith Crisis Feel Like?" And I want to share it with you, some points, just to see if this describes your journey that you're going through right now. Because I think a lot of times people that we know, which are leaving the church or religion, it shocks us. But there's a reason why it's shocking. It's because we're just finding out about it. But there is often a long history behind your crisis. And so let me share this article. It says, quote, "For most Christians, the intensity of their doubt falls into the mildly to moderately troubling range. In relation to faith, health, these battles with doubt are like battling a bad cold or a flu. They require care, but they are not faith-threatening. However, a minority of Christians, though I'd say a substantial minority, endure one or more seasons of doubt so intense, we've given them that special term, faith crises. When doubt becomes crises. To call these experiences crises is not hyperbole. When a confluence of factors moves us to question whether our fundamental understanding of reality is indeed true, it can feel like our world is on the verge of collapse. In relation to faith health, this kind of doubt is more like a heart attack or stroke." Now we're going to go through the stages of a faith crisis. Stage 1, the buildup. A person's faith crisis often appears to happen suddenly. Someone you know, perhaps you, seems to have a strong, sturdy faith. Then all of a sudden, it looks like their faith is falling apart. And you wonder, what happened? Although that's the way it often appears, rarely do such crises come out of nowhere. Almost always, destabilizing elements have been building up under the surface, even if the person wasn't fully aware. All of us experience and observe realities that don't seem to make sense with our Christian worldview or our theological framework. Like I was saying at the beginning, these things build. You might get a question in your mind that's like a splinter, and it just grows over time. All right, stage number 2, the catalyst. Sometimes a catalyst moment is a significant life event, like a betrayal or a tragedy. But often it is an apparently and surprisingly insignificant event, like an offhanded comment someone makes in an ordinary conversation. Whatever the catalyst event, when it occurs, it ignites a kind of chain reaction. It's as if the various destabilizing elements that have built up now psychologically fuse together in a sudden awareness that the person's belief system, Christianity as the ultimate reality, might not be true, but might instead be like other belief systems, a human construct. This awareness produces a kind of internal explosion. The catalyst is more like a lit match dropped on an accumulated pile of tinder, or like the last Jenga block pulled that suddenly brings the weakened structure down. And when it happens, the person usually finds himself suddenly caught in a raging spiritual tempest, end quote. Yeah, how many people are sitting by you in the pews at church or in Sunday school, and they're just struggling, and they're not believing any of this, or parts of it just they can't accept anymore? Probably a lot more than you think. All right, stage 3, the storm. Quote, "For those who haven't experienced a faith crisis, it's hard to capture in words what it feels like. As I have tried, I have found a storm to be a helpful metaphor. The human brain is a remarkably, even incomprehensibly, powerful and complex creation. The speed at which it can process, especially in a state of alarm, is incredible. And people in the initial stages of a faith crisis are typically in a state of alarm. The brain is processing in overdrive, and not only processing the Christian claims in question, but the possible implications of those bedrock claims proving untrue. And they're trying to resolve those overwhelming questions in a storm of anguishing emotions," end quote. I love this breakdown of the 3 stages of a faith crisis. That's exactly what I've seen, not only in other people, but in myself. So when I say there are people in the pews who are deeply concerned and troubled, or just going through the motions because their family goes and there's expectations, or it's just what they've always done, or they've committed some great sin and they're wrestling with that, those people are probably a huge chunk of the body of Christ. And that's okay. That's why you're here with this video. That's why we're examining it. Let's move on. Now let's go back to why I said you're not special, you're not unique. So don't be cocky in your faith crisis. The scriptures are full of people of faith crisis. I want to see if you relate to some of these individuals, which we have read about so many times. But we've been given these insights for this exact reason. I found this great article called 14 Bible Characters Who Wrestled with Their Faith and Won, and it's on crosswalk.com. Now, I like this article because it's full of people like me and like you, people that question their faith or even lost their faith at points. And so let's go through a few of these and let's see if you and I can relate to them in their faith struggles. Simonpeter. I love this guy. The article says, one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus, Peter is known for his boldness It was Peter who was commended by Jesus for receiving the revelation from the Father that Jesus was the Son of the living God. Yes, that's the first count where one of the apostles truly declared, you are the Son of God. You're the Messiah. So Peter was awesome. But when Jesus was arrested, Peter wrestled between faith and fear. He denied knowing Jesus with cursing and swearing. Peter had been so certain of his faith before that. He said, I won't deny you. Jesus knew he really wasn't, though. Jesus had predicted Peter's denial and prayed for Peter's faith to not fail. And it didn't. Peter's faith brought him back to Jesus, who not only reconciled him, but asked him to feed his sheep. You ever been like Peter? Next guy, Thomas, my namesake, says, quote, being a disciple of Jesus doesn't automatically make one a faith giant. Thomas became known as Doubting Thomas because he wrestled with the truth that Jesus rose from the dead. Do you question that? Do you question if Jesus actually lived and rose from the dead? He goes on to say, but his wrestling with faith was as human as the labeling of him. Thomas was not the only disciple to wrestle with the truth of the resurrection. All of the disciples wrestled with believing when Mary and the other women came and told them Jesus was alive. It's important to point out the grace of God for those who wrestle. The 11 didn't believe until Jesus appeared to them, and then he appeared again just for Thomas. Oh, man. All right, we have the example of the father of a sick boy. It says, quote, I love this story. Here's a father with a son who's mute and has seizures. He takes his son to the disciples of Jesus to be healed and comes away no different. Wrestling with his faith, he brings his son to Jesus, asking if Jesus can help. But knowing he's wrestling with his faith, the father responds honestly. He cries for help to win his faith wrestling match with the words, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus brought the victory. Jesus will help us win our wrestling matches by his grace. Another example, Gideon. Israel was in trouble when God approached Gideon, declaring him to be a mighty warrior and calling him to save his people from the Midianites. But Gideon balked at the words and the call. Gideon was wrestling with his faith with questions similar to those we deal with. He wondered, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? He felt God had abandoned them, but he cried out for favor. Gideon's appeal for grace was answered abundantly, and he fulfilled his mission as led by the Lord. And I would add to that the question of, why has this happened to us? The question of human suffering. If you're not in touch with the divine, getting revelation on why he allows these evil things to happen, you're left to your own devices and to philosophers online and in history to try to answer that question for you. I'd rather get my answers from the source. I encourage you to do the same. All right, Moses. Quote, one of the most prominent figures in the Bible endured many faith wrestling matches. He struggled to believe he could deliver his people from Egypt after murdering an Egyptian and being rejected by his Hebrew brothers. After this, he ran into the wilderness until the time when the Lord appeared to him in the burning bush. But when God called him to do what he'd run away from, he wrestled with his faith with questions like, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? Moses struggled with God's response, claiming he couldn't do the public speaking. Frustrated with Moses, the Lord allowed him to have his brother Aaron help him. Every wrestling match that Moses went through was met with the grace of God. End quote. And I also heard an insight from a friend that Moses might not have spoken the Hebrew language, it wasn't just he had a speech impediment like I thought. It may have been he couldn't communicate, but Aaron could. Aaron was of the Hebrews. A couple more examples. Abraham. Abraham is known as the father of our faith. I was intimidated by Abraham's faith until I learned how much he wrestled with it and how the wrestling didn't stop him from receiving from God. The Bible tells us that because he believed God, he was made righteous. Sounds instant and simple. Yet it took God telling Abraham the promise 7 times before Abraham was fully convinced. The 6th time God promised, Abraham fell down and laughed. After this, God told him to name the son Isaac, which means laughter. This gives me great hope. Abraham is an example that even if we keep wrestling, we can win. End quote. Let me ask you, in your faith crisis, are you still laughing? Are you still lighthearted? Or are you weighed down? Don't forget that this life is that we might have joy and that we are created in the image of the Creator and that he will help us. So if you're wrestling with questions, don't forget that you need to find ways to fill joy even if you don't have the answers that you seek yet. All right, couple more. Sarah. The wife of Abraham, quote, went through her own time wrestling with faith while Abraham was going through his. She was barren for many years and passed off as Abraham's sisters 2 times to different kings. 11 years passed after God's promise for a child, and her wrestling led her to a bad plan that ended in the birth of Ishmael. But the promise was for her to have a child, not just Abraham. 13 years after Ishmael was born, God declared his promise of a son 3 more times for a total of 7. After the 7th time, Sarah laughed, unable to fathom having a child at her age. But nothing is too hard for the Lord. All right, and the last example and the most sacred, Jesus Christ. It says, Jesus Christ knew who he was and how he was going to die. He said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing of my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, he felt our humanity under the intense pressure. He asked if there was another way. He knew there wasn't, and he stuck with what he knew and fulfilled his mission of laying down his life for us. Jesus won everything for us in his wrestling match. He declared, it is finished. And then on the cross, I would add, end quote, on the cross I would add, he said, Father, why have you forsaken me? That has to do with a lot more than just an expression of emotion. But Jesus Christ understands perfectly what you're going through. He has all the answers. But he gets you. And these people get you. These are Bible characters which we've been given the record of their faith challenges. As this article says, faith wrestles. So you're not special in questioning God and questioning reality. It's just what you do with these questions that will determine your path. And if you come out of this better than you were before. All right, part 3. Our final point is the proper way to deal with it. Now, I want to help you change your perspective. What if we came through this faith crisis together and made the world better for it? Is your motivation truth, or is it something else? All right, I found this great article on ldsliving.com titled Elder Holland Gives Can't Miss Address on Questions, Doubt, and Faith. The article says, quote, I readily acknowledge that everyone has some gospel question or other yet to be answered, he said. Though now we see through a glass darkly, Elder Holland promised that it will not always be so. If we are patient in all things, eventually all will be made clear. Not all gospel questions have answers yet, he says, but they will come. The article continues, quote, what conceivable historical or doctrinal or procedural issue that may arise among any group could ever overshadow or negate one's consuming spiritual conviction regarding the Father's merciful plan of salvation, his only begotten Son's birth, mission, and atonement, and resurrection, personal experience with true miracles, and on and on and on? Questions are sure to come, Elder Holland acknowledged. However, he said, we would hope for skeptic, believer, and everyone in between that humility, faith, and the influence of the Holy Spirit would always be elements of every quest for truth. That foundational truths would always be the reference points in that quest, and that all other issues which may yet need resolving are pursued by study and also by faith. At the end of the day, all of us must make distinctions between the greater and the lesser elements of our testimony. For me, the great pillars include those majestic truths mentioned earlier, the irreplaceable centrality in my life, and the realization that I simply could not live, I could not go on without them, or without the blessings I have known, or without the promises we have all been given. But I like what Elder Holland said. At the end of the day, all of us must make distinctions between the greater and the lesser elements of our testimony. The fact that Jesus Christ is the center, he said, we would hope for the skeptic, the believer, and everyone in between that humility and faith, and the influence of the Holy Spirit would always be the elements of every quest for truth. And that foundational truth would always be the reference points in that quest. So that's what I encourage you in your faith quest. Seek the truth at all costs. I like that he emphasizes humility, not just faith, but humility and being open to the influence of the Holy Spirit to get the answers and the resolution that we so desperately seek. And what if you got resolution to your questions? Just imagine that. What if you actually resolved it, but you had an answer that you'd never considered? All right, as we wrap this up, I want to go back to that article that I shared from before called Why I Never Had a Faith Crisis Over Science. Because I love the experience of this woman and how her father handled her questions on the topic of science. She says, quote, be willing to say, I don't know. In the 70s and 80s, I grew up in a wonderful church in the suburbs of Minneapolis, a white evangelical church back when evangelical meant an emphasis on evangelism, not politics. This community grounded me in the faith, giving me a bedrock conviction that God exists and loves me. My Sunday school teachers and the Bible quiz team fostered me a deep knowledge and love of the Bible. But I've met many people who have had similar upbringings and yet walked away from the church over science. That's because there are other messages too. When it came to Genesis and the age of the earth, my church knew only two options. One was a godless evolution with a godless Big Bang billions of years ago. The other option was a creator God who made the universe in 6 days, following the text in Genesis. Given those two choices, of course we picked the one with the creator. I remember my dad taking us kids to a young earth creationism event when I was in elementary school, and I loved it. We got to talk about the Bible and science at the same time. Many kids today enjoy the Creation Museum for the same reason. Unfortunately, though, these anti-evolution views lead many to a crisis of faith. A big reason I didn't have a crisis at this point was the reaction of my parents. When I got to biology class at my public high school, I was nervous to turn the page to the chapter on evolution. I had been told that evolution was a bad word, that most scientists are atheists, and that I couldn't trust what scientists say. I'll pause there. That's a lie. There are many scientists who aren't atheists that believe in an organizing force or a creator. Anyway, going back to it. So I was surprised to find that the textbook's description of science of natural selection actually made sense. I brought the book home and sat at the kitchen table with my dad to tell him what I was learning. We went back and forth recalling the young earth arguments and wondering if they stood up to the textbook. Finally, my dad sat back and said, I don't know. I still remember how my shoulders relaxed. It was okay not to know. I think I was expecting him to tell me the right answer or to give me anti-evolution arguments to use against my biology teacher. Instead, he came alongside me and wrestled with the questions I was asking. In that moment, I learned that a mature Christian adult can struggle over issues without putting their whole faith at risk. And I learned that some issues are secondary to our core beliefs. Christians can struggle and even disagree while still being disciples of Jesus together. End quote. Now, the author of that article I just read was Deborah Harzma, the president of BioLogos. She's an astrophysicist and frequent speaker on modern science and Christian faith at research universities, churches, and public venues like the National Press Club. I don't know her. I'm not necessarily endorsing everything she says, but I love what her dad did. And I want to say as a dad, I don't have many answers. There are many mysteries of God and of this universe that I don't have the answers to, but that's okay. My main thing is, where is my heart and is my path towards what I perceive as truth? And am I open to more truth? Are you open to more truth? Do you want to come out of this faith crisis better? Do you want to be stronger? Do you want to be intellectually honest? Do you not want to give in to hedonism and just go sin your life away and let your kids see that? I want to encourage you to keep truth as the focus and to not freak out. In fact, I came up with the steps to overcoming a faith crisis. I did research many of these, but this is a list that I came up with because I've had my own faith crises, and I think these worked for me. Here's the steps to overcoming a faith crisis. Number 1, don't freak out. Your world is not ending. Everything will eventually be okay. Embrace the wrestle. You're about to level up. Step 2, get everyone out of the room. Now, you can rely on a church leader or a confidant that is open to helping you, like this lady's father was in that article. But I want to encourage you to be careful of anyone who has a financial interest in you moving away from your faith. There are literal predators out there who will capitalize on your strugglings. This is between you and God. This is your chance to build spiritual muscles. So I would ask God to provide a shepherd, someone you can trust. There's no shame in struggling with your faith. None. Step number 3, don't announce it to the world. Take some time, especially if you have kids. This will impact them greatly. It may shift their foundation and rock their world if you've raised them in the church. Think of the impact of how you handle this chapter in your life, both now and in the future, and how it will affect your offspring. This will have long-term consequences. So take it seriously. I'm sure you are. Step number 4, get into the Word. Read the stories of people who have struggled, both contemporary examples, but also scriptural. And I mean, ideally, you would not stop attending church or avoid Christians. I know many of you already are, and you're just trying to take a break. I need to get out of it. I understand that. But once again, seek truth at all costs, and don't run away from people who can necessarily help you. There might be some smart brother or sister in the congregation who actually has been through what you've been through. So when I said don't announce it to the world, that doesn't mean don't talk to people about it. But going on social media and just pummeling this church is false and God's not real and all this, it's like, I don't know how that helps you. Maybe that's part of your process, though, so no condemnation here. Step number 5, pray, pray, pray. Fast, fast, fast. Meditate, meditate, meditate. Ponder, ponder, ponder. So this kind of harkens back to step number 2, which is to get everyone out of the room. And then step number 6, remember. Think back on all the blessings you have in your life. Whether or not you now believe they come from God, just think of all the good things. And this faith crisis doesn't undermine that. And this includes in religion. If you've had spiritual experiences that really impacted you and blessed you, don't throw those away, even if you are looking at new information and data. All right, and the final step, 7, be patient. Patiently wait on God, making Jesus your best friend. And remember, God loves you, and I love you. And I'm glad that if you sat through this, that you consider what I've said. I had my own faith crisis in 2020, which coincidentally happened with the pandemic. I worked through that, and God gave me some surprising answers on that. Answers I would have never come up with, and everything worked out. And now I'm even stronger and more educated than I was before. In fact, I look back at how asleep I was, and maybe in the near future I'll look back on this time and think, man, you were really asleep. That's the point. We don't know everything, and it's okay to accept that truth. Well, that's our episode. What do you think? Well, you can let us know on all of the social platforms, the video platforms, podcasts. We're on a lot of those, so we encourage you to go check us out on those. Just look for Open the Matrix Podcast. And then I want to remind you, patreon.com/openthematrixpodcast. That's my musical efforts. I write, I sing, I perform. Got a couple of cool music videos over there, so go to patreon.com/openthematrixpodcast. And please, at least, it's free. Subscribe and follow me, and you'll see our music productions. And then once again, if you want to give us a tip here, just go on Venmo and look for The Firestarter. That's The Firestarter on Venmo. If you threw us a little tip there, I would greatly appreciate it. It helps out with all of this production. Now, as is tradition, I'm going to end this broadcast with a poem I wrote, which is tied into this topic. This is from a song called Vanity. It says, quote, "What is truth? Said the prefect to the king. What's the level we all stand on? The maker's golden mean? Vanity of vanities, within reality's scenes, is the man who worships self, and this is what it means. What is truth? Said the preacher who was king. That wisdom is grief, and there is no new thing? But if all is vanity and vexation of spirit, why does God delight in our prayers and is glad to hear it?" All right, well, thank you for joining us for this episode. This is The Firestarter, and we'll see you next time.